Today is our second Advanced Topics in Semi-Diplomatic Transcriptions webinar. We're calling this one Doing It with Style. This is the last webinar of our semi-diplomatic transcriptions topic. Boo, I know, but don't worry, we've got more webinars coming up, starting with collations next month. But today we're going to be talking about styling your semi-dip text. Before we begin, I would, as always, like to introduce myself. I'm Navarra. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the project manager for LEMDO. I've been working with the project for about 3 years, and I've done a lot of work on our generic semi-diplomatic transcription styling, but also on actually encoding transcriptions and making them look nice. Outside of LEMDO, I'm big into sewing. I'm just about to start on a pair of overalls that I'm going to be embroidering dinosaurs on. So with that being said, I tend to be a bit of a fidgeter. You'll see my hands moving around. If that's you too, you want to move around a little bit, you want to be knitting or taking notes or doodling or whatever, please feel free to do so. I also would like to start off with a territorial acknowledgement. We acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. We're going to go over a few things today. First off, we're going to be doing a quick refresh on our key CSS vocabulary and syntax so that we're all at a good base point for the rest of our learning today. We're then going to move into some new stuff so that by the end of the day, you know what our CSS or what our SCSS kind of is looking at. You're able to update your files tags decal with file-wide styling. You're able to style specific elements using the style attribute. And you're going to know how to use your browser's inspector view to test style. We're going to be using 2 specific examples as we're working through these. The first is with Hungwords, and the second is with long braces. So starting with a quick refresh on our CSS vocabulary and syntax. The first big thing that we should all be on the same page about is what is CSS. It stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's just what we use to style LEMDO. With CSS, style goes from a generic styling that applies to everything down to the more specific style that applies to just your file, and then to the style that applies to just one element. And so the more specific we get, it overrides the previous more generic stuff. For other vocabulary, we have our selectors, and they just tell us what we want to style. We use HTML selectors in our SCSS file and TEI in our tags decal. So you'll be working more on the TEI, but you'll get to look a little bit at HTML as well today. And they look like this. So with our HTML, we have span, which is what a stage element turns into through our processing. So it's span with the data L attribute and a value of stage. And that's a selector. So it's saying, hey, let's style everything that is a span element that is a data L of stage. And in our TEI, it's really simple. It's just the stage element. So we just put stage. Declarations are the thing that tell us what we actually want to do with that element. So we have 2 parts of our declaration. First, we have the properties, which tell us kind of what category of style that we're applying. I kind of think of these in the same kind of terms of what attributes do on our TEI. They're giving us a category of adjective. And for syntax, they're always going to be followed by a colon. Our values give us the specific style. This is our actual adjective itself. And they're going to be followed by a semicolon. So what that looks like is we're going to have a selector. Then in our SCSS file, we're going to have curly brackets. In your tags decal, it's just going to be inside of the text node, but we have selector, and then we have our property, value, semicolon. When I have two of these declarations, I tend to put them on a new line. It's not necessary. It is kind of the standard to do in our tags decal. So that's what it's going to look like. I'm also going to mention, as we're kind of going over these key pieces of knowledge, our specificity. So at our last style webinar, we talked a little bit about how the cascade of CSS means we can override our style, which is usually really helpful, but it can also cause some confusion and issues, especially with complex projects like LEMDO is, because we've got a few things that are kind of interacting with each other that we need to keep in mind. So I've whipped up this chart that kind of explains how the specificity at LEMDO works. And it's based on two criteria. The first is our location of our CSS. So physically, where is this in our project? And then also specificity of selector. Now, all things being equal in CSS, when you're looking at a file, the top of the file is the least specific and the bottom is the most specific. So I've kind of done that here as well. So what's at the top is the least specific and what's at the bottom is the most. And if we're looking at location, our least specific, our generic style is coming from our SCSS. And we have two SCSS things that apply. We have our LEMDO dev SCSS, and that's just the very basic LEMDO stuff. That's things like, what font do we use? What size is the font? It defines what color things are. And then we also have our semi-dip SCSS, and that's specific to semi-diplomatic transcriptions. And that's slightly more specific than just the LEMDO dep is. Slightly more specific than that, we have rendition attributes, and the reason they're not that specific is because they're coming from the taxa1 file. So they're shared. We then have our tags decal, which goes in your file. It applies to your file only, and it applies across the entire file. And then we have the style attribute. And style attributes go on one specific element. They apply only to that element. And so they're as close as you can get, essentially. When it comes to the specificity of the selector itself, things change up a little bit. And this is where we sometimes come across issues. So when we're looking at least specific, we're now kind of looking at renditions a lot of the time and the tags decal a lot of the time. But depending on how you write the selector, this can change a little bit. So because in your tags decal, you're using a TEI element, it's seen kind of as less specific than the HTML element, because an HTML element in the LEMDO case almost always has an attribute on it. Most of the time it's a data element or attribute, sorry. Whereas in our TEI, we can just say stage. So that's, if you're seeing problems coming from my tags decal isn't doing anything, that's often what it is. And it's just kind of sorting through what is styling and where the specificities are coming from. Within our SCSS, again, it kind of depends on how you write your selector. So less specific is just your straight up element with an attribute. So that's that span with data L stage we were looking at before. You can make it more specific by saying how it fits in with the document flow. So if we know that there is a div with a data L as AB that has a child span data place with includes right, this is more specific. This is saying hey, there's going to be something that has right in its place attribute, and it's going to be a child of an AB. And so that gives us extra information, and that says this is more specific. And then we have style, and style is just, because it's on the element itself, it overrides pretty much everything. Are there questions coming out of this right now? No? Okay, I will keep
There's nothing in the chat so far.
Okay, I will continue on then. So how do we actually do these things? First, we're going to be talking about the tags decal element, which we use to add a file-wide style. As you know, we're using the tags decal for things that are true across your entire file. So let's say all of your running titles are italic. You don't want to have to put a rendition of R&D italic on every single running title. You can just put it once in your tags decal and then it will apply. And to use it, you're first going to find your encoding desk in your file. It's a child of TEI header, and it comes after the profile desk. Here it is. It's going to have a paragraph that talks about how we encode this, and then it'll have an editorial declaration, and then it ends just above the revision desk. You're then going to add a tags decal in there. Tags decal will come after your editorial declaration. Once you've got a tags decal to actually add some styling, you're going to add a rendition element as a child of tags decal, and then add a selector attribute. Here my selector is label because I want to style label elements. You then always need to add a scheme attribute with a value of CSS. We're always going to be using CSS in this, so you can just say it's a scheme CSS. Once you've got that done, this is your selector in our tags decal. You can then add your declaration. So here I'm saying I want the font style of my labels to be italic. Quick tip, when you're styling something that has attributes, the attributes go inside of square brackets and the value goes inside of single quotation marks in our tags decal. So that's what that would look like here. If we wanted to only style label when it has a type attribute and a value of heading, we're going to keep that label in the selector. We're going to add our square brackets, and inside we'll put type equals and then heading in our single quotation marks. And you can add as many of those as you need to for what you want. Last time we talked about style, we were talking about adding the rendition and place attributes in our files. This time we're going to talk about the style attribute, which I think is really fun. It requires a bit of CSS knowledge, but it lets you get really into what you're doing. We don't often need to use style, but it does come up, and we use it when we have something that isn't represented by either rendition or place values that we have in our pre-made taxonomies, or if that specificity that we looked at earlier today means that a rendition just isn't going to work in a specific case. So when we do use the style attribute, our first step is to find the smallest element that our style applies to. If there's nothing that wraps exactly around what you want to style, you'll need to add a high element. So if you just wanted to style the word speech here, you would need to add high around it because there's no container element that is only around speech. In this case, let's just say we're going to style our very generic speech prefix, and we want it to be centered and on its own line. We know it's on its own line because we have an LB here. And we could do that with a rendition, but just for this example, to keep it kind of simple, we're going to use style instead. So the first thing again is we're going to find the text that we want to style and make sure it's wrapped in an element that contains only what we want to style and also all of what we want to style. Here it's wrapped in speaker. Next, we're going to add our style attribute. It goes on whatever that element was. Here it's on speaker. And then comes the fun part. We get to figure out our declaration. Now, if you've never worked in CSS or you forget things, which happens to all of us, it's a lot to remember, you need to be able to find what the properties are and what the values are that can go on those properties. And I'm going to recommend two places to find that. One of them is the W3 schools. They have a CSS reference page. So this is the World Wide Web Consortium, and they have just a page that lists all of our properties that we have for CSS. It looks like this. You can go through listed alphabetical. If you know what you're looking for, you can type in the search bar and then just click on whatever it is you're looking for to learn more about it. The other place is MDN. That's the Mozilla Developers Network. This tends to be my go-to, but sometimes, you know, the first couple of times that you're using it, it can seem a little daunting. That's okay. Once you get into it, you feel really cool like a developer. So often you can just put in your Google search bar or whatever browser you use and search MDN and then whatever it is you're looking for. And then it'll take you to the page for that property. Otherwise, you can search MDN CSS. It'll bring you to something like this. And there's a list of all of the properties. The ones we're using most often in LEMDO, I'd say on style, are margin, font style, display, and position. But we certainly also use others, and it's a good exercise to just kind of go through and find what you might be interested in or what you might need to lay out your page. So once we've found what our declaration is, we're going to just add it in as the value on our style attribute. So here we're saying that we want this font to be in Roman type, so it's going to be font style of normal. And then we also want it to display block, which is just going to make sure that this overrides our generic styling for speaker, which makes it appear on the same line as our speech. Are there any questions about how this is working here?
There are no questions in the chat.
Okay. So once you've actually added your styling in, you'll want to look at it on our dev site so that you know if you need to tweak it. You can also see how your actual tweaking will look, which is really cool. We're going to look at our examples for doing this so that you can see it in action, but we'll start with the basics of using Inspector so that you kind of know the steps for what to do. So when you are wanting to tweak your styling, the first thing that you're going to need to do is open up the LEMDO dev site in your browser. Assuming you're already an editor, you have access to this. We also call it our Jenkins site. If you're not an editor, you're probably not actually doing this in practice, but you could do the same thing with any website. My favorite thing to do is see if I can close out of different pop-ups using CSS on different websites. It blows my mom away, makes me very happy. Anyhow, so you're going to open up your LEMDO dev site and then find your edition. If you haven't done this before, all you need to do is go to the Additions tab at the top and then find what it is that you're looking for. Once you're there, you're going to navigate to your semi-diplomatic transcription page. This is Henry V, the first quarto. You'll right-click what you're interested in looking at, and then click Inspect. This is going to look similar across all of your browsers. I took screenshots from Firefox, but it's the same on Chrome and Safari and Edge. And then once you hit Inspect, this pops up. It might be at the bottom, or it might be on the right. Wherever it is, it's going to have the same information, and you can change where it is, typically by clicking the three dots or the whatever the equivalent is on your browser. And you can use this to explore everything that's on the page. There are a few kind of key features that you'll use when you're trying to tweak your styling. The first is this little button up here. It's like a square with a cursor on it. And it allows you, if you select this, you can go back onto your page and click anywhere on there to find the element that it is, which we'll look at in a second so that it kind of makes more sense. This section that says Search HTML shows the page HTML. So it's got our body. If we keep going down, we have our main container, which contains the title, Henry V, Quarto 1. Then if we keep going down, it starts containing our page beginnings. It says PB. Here we have our title page with its doc title elements inside. So you can kind of go through and see what your TEI actually turns into by scrolling through here and exploring. This bottom part on the left shows the style. And so this is what we're going to really be talking about today. But it's good to become familiar with all of the parts of this so that you know what you're looking at. But in this style, it shows what applies to the element that you're looking at. So here I can see that our semi-diplomatic SCSS is applying to our doc title, and it's making it be centered, and it's giving it specific line heights. Some just normal LEMDO dev SCSS is also applying. And then inline, the thing that I clicked on, somebody's added an italic rendition. And so again, this is actually opposite from what an SCSS file looks like because the most specific stuff here is at the top. A couple of tips for using your inspector. You can only tweak the style if the element is in the HTML. If it's not there, you can't, do things with it. But once you commit your file, it's going to be, about an hour between when you commit it and when it's on the site. And then once it's there until you change it, of course. We're going to look at two examples so you can see how this actually works. The first of which is Hungwords. So we're going to move turnovers over, and we're going to move turnunders under our lines. The first thing that we do, just with our basic encoding for Hungwords, is we wrap them in seg. So here we have a speech. This is from Honest Horror Part 1, First Quarto. We've got, I am sure by all superscriptions, it was the party you ciphered, and ciphered here is a Hungword. Now we have two types of Hungwords. The first is a turn over, like we have in this example. May we with right and conscious make this claim, where claim is on the line over the line that it semantically continues. We also have our turn under, where it's under the line that they continue. So would suck her eggs, playing the mouse in absence of the cat. Cat is under the line that it continues, so it's a turn under. And so we have both of those types that we can use as values here. So we have our seg, a type attribute, and then either a turn over or a turn under. In this case, it was a turn under. It went under the line. In either case, it's just going to go at the end of the line that it's continuing in our encoding. So it will go after the word that precedes it in the sentence. If that makes sense. Once we've added our type, we're going to add style, and this is what will let us move it around. There are a couple of things that we use to move it. The first is going to be position absolute. And keep in mind, we still have our colon and our semicolon here. And this just makes it so that the word is being moved within the container of the speech or the stage direction that it's in. It lets us move the word around a bit more freely. And then we add our margin. This is what lets us actually move the word around. I've got two values on here, separated by a space, and we'll look at what these actually mean right now. So to explain how these different margin values work, I'm going to talk a little bit about margin. So every element has 4 margins. If we imagine our element is a little box like this, that's going to help us to kind of visualize this. So our first margin is the top. In CSS, this is called margin top, and it actually is its own property. So you could put margin top as however many pixels or rems or units that you want. And it moves things from the top. So it starts at the top and then it pushes it down. When you add to margin top, the block gets pushed down. Next, we have margin right. When we add to that, it pushes things to the left because it starts on the right and then moves because there's space being added there. Margin bottom is on the bottom. When we add to it, it pushes things up. And then we have margin left, which when we add to that, it pushes things to the right. It's being moved from the left over. So we can use each of those as individual properties, margin top, margin right, margin bottom, margin left, or we can just use the margin property and know that when we add multiple values, it means that we're adding margin in the order I just showed you. So in that clockwise order, top, right, bottom, left. This is what it essentially looks like. We have our margin property with a colon, and then you'll put whatever your top value is, whatever your right value is, the bottom value, and then the left value. And then after all of that, we have our semicolon. So that's what we're looking at here. Because there are only 2, this is our top margin, and this is our right margin. Note that they also need a unit. Here I'm using rem. That's the equivalent, I believe, of 16 pixels. And it just tends to be a fairly adaptable unit. So it's what we tend to use at LEMDO. And then once we've done that, we get to check and adjust our style in the inspector. You can do this in any browser. Again, I'm going to use Firefox, and I'm going to share that screen now if I can find it. There we go. So let's look for that. Here's the word. I haven't added the style yet, but we can actually do that here and then add it to our TEI. So I'm going to go here, right click on the word, and go to inspect. I get my pop-up here. Let's see if I can make it any bigger. There we go. here's that button I was talking about. So if I click this and I click on ciphered, you see that on the right-hand side of the screen, that line gets highlighted blue. That's the element that I'm looking at. If I click that, it will kind of keep that focus. So I see that that sag element turned into a span element with data L sag. And I have my data type of turn under. In here, I'm going to add my position absolute. And then let's add a margin. Now, this is a turn under. So our lines in LEMDO are 1.8 rems. So when you're doing a turn under, you add 1.8 rems and it pushes it down 0.8. And when you're doing a turnover, it's usually negative 1.8, and that moves it up 1.8 rems. Then let's put in, say, negative 10 rem. That's what I'd put in our slide. And that moves it over quite a bit to the left. If we look at the facsimile, here's our word ciphered right here. It's not that far to the left, so I need to adjust it. And I can do that again right here in my CSS section by just adjusting the number on there. Let's say it's 8. 8 rems. It's still too far. We try 2 rems, not far enough. 5 is just right. And so you can see it actually move by adjusting the numbers here. Now, when we change the numbers in here, or when we change the style in here, it doesn't do anything to the TEI. It doesn't do anything to our shared repo. We need to take it back to the file in Oxygen and then update the encoding there. So I'm going to, of course, update my local copy of the repo before I do anything by CD into my LEMDO directory and doing an SVN up. It was already up to date. Then I head over to Oxygen. I'm going to find my file, which lives, as all of our text files do, inside of data/text. I'm looking at Honest4, first quarto of part 1. And I can look things up in a couple of ways. I'm going to just look for turn under because I know that's what it is. And here's my ciphered. So if I add my style, know that I had my position of absolute. I know that I had my margin of 0.8 rem and negative 5 rem. Now, if I save and validate and commit this file, then I've made the change. So just because you've done it in the browser doesn't mean it's actually been done. You always need to actually do it in your file for your thing to take place. Okay. Are there any questions at that point? No? Awesome. I always find this is so fun because you get to actually see things in real time, which is very exciting. Next, we'll look at long braces. Now, long braces, we see these in things like cats lists a lot. And for them, we use something called flexbox. This is a thing in CSS that just lets us lay out our elements in a column or a row, makes layout a lot easier. We don't use it a lot outside of this context, but for these, it is really useful. So the first thing that we need to do is, of course, find our long brace. Here are a few examples from the second part of Henry IV. In the first folio, we've got quite a few of them on this page. I've used this one here as the example. Then we're going to figure out what's in our area that we're styling. Here we've got everything on the left here, our long bracket, and then we've got, oh, whoops, then we've got our opposites against King Henry IV. Then we need to go from our early modern page to our TEI, which in a PowerPoint looks like a really stark contrast always. But this is the same thing. So we have a cast group and then a cast item with a lot of different roles in it, each of which has its own LB. We have our bracket wrapped in a meta mark element, and then we have our role desk. The first thing that we're going to do is add style to the container element. So here, cast group is the element that contains all of this. If there wasn't a container element, we would add seg. Next, we're going to add display flex. And this says, hey, we're going to use flexbox here. Then we get to decide on our flex direction. We have row, which aligns things vertically, and we have column, which aligns things horizontally. If whatever you choose here doesn't work, try the other one and see what happens. This is a place where it's good to experiment and kind of figure it out through trial, which of course you can do in the browser using the same inspector that we just tried out. You might need to use align items as center. It kind of depends on your exact example. Of course, everything's going to be a little bit different on the early modern page, so we're going to need to do different things to make it look good. Note here that for center, we're using American spelling. We've got that ER rather than RE. That's just how CSS is. We use the American spellings. Then we're going to add style to our meta mark. So this has said that everything here is going to be flex. It's going to be a column, but then we also need to style the actual bracket itself. The first thing that you're going to need to add as a value of style is our transform property. It has two different scales that you can transform it on. The first is scale Y. This stretches it out vertically. So this is saying it's stretched out 15 times its original size. And then scale X stretches it horizontally along the X axis. And it's 3 times in this case. You're then going to add the transform origin. So where are we stretching it from? Typically, we're going to use left to top. Again, experiment. If it doesn't look how you want it to, try some different values. And then we add our margin. When we did this one, this was just done with the two different properties, margin left, margin top. You could also just use margin. It's up to you what kind of makes most sense and how you prefer to do things. And then you get to tweak it until it looks good. So when we encoded this, the person who was working on it said, oh, you know what, this looks a lot better if I also add style to the role desk and add some margins in there. So that's what they did. And it looks pretty good. So if we go back to our browser, here it is. These are all of our long brackets. This is the one that we were just looking at. If we inspect it, and then click on that area, in our HTML here, we will find the meta mark. So we have our cast group. That's a span data L equals cast group in HTML. Then we have our cast item, span data L is cast item. After that, we have our meta mark, span data L equals meta mark. If we click on that, we see here is that styling that we added. If we wanted to change it, we could just go ahead and do that. So let's say that we only wanted it to be actually 2. You can do that. And it changes the height, as you can see. But we decided that 15 was about the size that matched what was on the original page. Similarly, you can change the X. Let's say we only wanted it to be 1, it would look like that. Say you wanted it to be 9, it would look like that. So it is very much a bit of a trial thing where you see what looks the most appropriate for your specific thing, and it's going to look different in every case. It's actually quite nice how the person who worked on this did it. I think quite good.
Navarra, we have a question in the chat from Laura and Alex. How does it know where to start the top of the brace?
How does it know where to start the top of the brace? I do believe it just looks at where the top of the actual character is. So this is the top of the brace. Does that make sense?
That would be my answer too.
But when you were adjusting the style in the browser, the top of the brace moved down from Northumberland. And now it's on Hastings.
Yeah, but it's looking at it as a column.
Okay.
By default, it's centered in the middle of the column.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so when you stretch it, it's going to move up and down equally in that column.
Okay. I'm thinking of this because I have 2 cast members with just a brace around their 2 names. And so I will create a cast group with just those 2 in it, and it will work with those 2. Okay. The next question I have is, in earlier sessions, we were hearing about the importance of like cell phones and display to access. Does this kind of styling travel across different interfaces? Because I mostly look at it from my computer, but I know that's not how everyone does it.
Yeah, it should work. So this is what it would look like on an iPad. And I can see that by clicking this little button up here. And I can adjust that. Let's see, some things turn out a little bit weird. And here it is on a phone. So you have to scroll left and right to see it, all just because of how much stuff there is, but our braces are still where we want them to be.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yep. We try to make everything on LEMDO as friendly as it can be on a phone, but semi-diplomatic transcriptions are probably the hardest thing to make look good on a phone, and we're not really expecting that people are going to be pulling those up in the classroom. Although editors who are editing on the train might do that.
Okay, are there any other questions right now? Those were 2 very good questions. All right, so let's just go over and recap that big pile of knowledge that we just went through. The first thing we talked about today was that refresh on CSS, which is of course the language that we're using to style our websites. It has the selectors and the declarations, with declarations being divided into the properties and the values. Our syntax is going to be our selector, and then a property, colon, value, semicolon. If we have multiple values, they'll be separated by a space. And we always need to consider that specificity thing. I should put this back into presenter view. There we go. We talked a bit about file-wide style, which is using that tag SECL element, works on the TEI. And each new selector is going to require a rendition element with selector and scheme attributes. Scheme is always going to equal CSS. When it comes to the style attribute, this adds CSS to elements in your TEI. You can find your properties and values on either W3 Schools or MDN. And you can tweak and experiment with those using the inspector view on your browser by going to browser, right-clicking on your web page, and then selecting inspector. You can do this in any browser. And between when you commit and when it's up on the website, it's going to be about an hour right now. And you can't tweak style on your elements if they're not there. So usually what I tend to do is when I've got these kind of special inline style things to work on, I get my encoding correct first, because that's always the most important part, is making sure that our TEI is truthful and accurate and correct, and then go and style it once that's all done. Style tends to be one of the last steps that I take when I'm encoding semi-diplomatic transcriptions. When we look at the example of Hungwords, our Hungwords are going to be wrapped in sag with the type of either turn over or turn under. Our style attribute should have a position absolute and a margin. And then you can experiment with the margin values. Typically, our line height for LEMDO is 1.8 rem. And so that's usually going to be your top or your margin. Bottom is 1.8. And then when you add margin, things move starting on that side. So if you add margin right, they move from the right over to the left. We looked at long brackets, which we use flexbox to style. The container element should have a display of flex, a flex direction of either column or row. And sometimes you'll also add a line item center, not always. The meta mark, that is the element around your actual bracket itself, that should have transform of scale Y. You might also have scale X. And then inside of the brackets, you'll put in your number. The one we looked at had 15 and 3, but depending on the size of your bracket, you'll need different scales. So try those out, experiment a little bit, and have fun. We're also going to have a transform origin. That's usually going to be left top, and we will have a margin. There are some resources that you can look at when you're going through these on your own. The first is in our LEMDO documentation. So we have pages on style. We've got an introduction, description of default style, some file-wide style practice, inline style practice, and then advanced style, which talks about using flexbox. We also have a page on encoding Hungwords. For external resources, I've put the MDN CSS reference and the W3 Schools CSS reference, both of which are handy to have. And I would like to say thank you to Shirk for funding this webinar series through a connection grant. Thank you, Shirk. This is awesome. I'm on here for slide design, so thank you to myself. Thanks for Martin for our TEI customization, and to HCMC for site design and hosting.